Okay, everyone. Well, welcome back. This is track one of the Resiliency Summit. And I have the pleasure of
It's
introducing
okay.
our next speakers. Um, and I am shocked that they can even be here today because every time I asked them, they were experiencing a wildfire. So thank you guys so much for agreeing to do this. We have with us today Monica Stoffel, who is the Executive Director of the California Resiliency Alliance, and Abby Browning, who's the Chief of Private Sector and NGO Coordination with the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. Thanks so much again for being here. Monica, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Laura, and welcome to all of our participants. It is kind of a luck that both Abby and I are able to be here after the storm we had last night. Both of us do have power and didn't need to do contingency planning to present. So to get us started, 2020 was a year filled with opportunity for lessons. It put to the test our plans, our adaptability, our understanding of systems and human behaviors. It tested all of us. In today's presentation, we will take a snapshot journey through 2020. Abby and I will be trading off, and as you will come to see, we each have our own approaches to reflecting back on what was a very trying year in capturing the lessons and insights. I want to start with paraphrasing from one of my favorite books, Meltdown: Why Systems Fail. Without feedback loops, which includes reflection and analysis of past actions, experience does not make us into better decision makers. Without those feedback loops, we don't develop the skills to tell us whether adding a tablespoon of salt will yield a bland soup or a salty mess. Part of today is looking back at 2020 to help us become better decision makers in the future. We start almost a year ago on January 21st, when the California Resiliency Alliance sent its first brief on what was then called the novel coronavirus 2019. That brief provided an overview of what had been reported to the WHO, how as of January 17th, 2020, there were 44 confirmed cases, 41 in the Wuhan province, 2 in Thailand and 1 in Japan. It talked about the CDC entry screenings at airports and how the California Department of Public Health was working with local entities on the evaluation of ill individuals who are returning from travel overseas, especially China. It also included a comment by a local health official. From what we know now, this does not appear to be something that should affect the daily lives of the millions of residents we serve. How different the world looks a year later. Looking back on that initial brief, some of what I have taken away is the importance of expanded horizon scanning. We all have our fingers on the pulses. What might seem benign to one person is a red flag for somebody else because they have a different understanding of how systems interact and cascading consequences. There is value in collective horizon scanning. Adding reference points to something when it's new. One of the most frequent requests I received early on is how do the novel coronavirus numbers compare to the seasonal influenza? People needed a reference point, a measuring stick, something to help them wrap their head around this novel event. At the request of members, I added that information to future briefs. Now, looking back, I wonder whether that was the right decision. Which leads me to the last point I have for this slide. We need to consider the potential unintended consequences of information as we share. If I had an opportunity to redo those early briefs last year, I probably would not have included the seasonal influenza numbers or done it in a very different way to not create the dichotomy between this of, oh, there's only 44 cases compared to the vast number of seasonal influenza cases. Instead, I would have looked at ways to help members better understand the power of exponential growth, how something can start slow and small, and then balloon rapidly to a size that was previously unimaginable. Information sharing is not just sharing information, but also about helping people understand it, which takes us to our next point.
So March the
Abby?
4th. Oh, am I, Monica, thank you for that information. And just to set the scene a little bit, like was mentioned before, and if you watched the little video, you saw me describing my role. I am with the state of California, and I work very closely with Monica and several partners up and down the state on providing this information. One of the great things about the California Resiliency Alliance and our partnership is that she can send out this information early. She can gather all of this information and respond directly to the members and what it is they are looking for. Because during this time, January, uh, personal side, I was very sick, and we all think now that I had COVID in January, but I was out of commission. And then February comes rolling around, and we were dealing with the repatriation of Americans from abroad, as well as starting to deal with the COVID crisis and the cruise ships. If you remember, there were several cruise ships that were coming into port, and California took a couple of them into California and handled all of the Americans and the non-Americans get to where they needed to go. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So on March the 4th, Governor Newsom, that's pictured there, Governor, declared a state of emergency for COVID-19. Now, why I mention that and the importance of it is we are still currently under that state of emergency for COVID-19. And when we have a state of emergency, several things are opened up for the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. We have in California something called the California Emergency Services Act that defines all of our roles and what authorities we have. It is very similar to the executive powers that are granted to the federal president and the executive branch during a disaster. And we have taken full advantage of those powers to help Californians. And one of the things that is most notable for my role, I have different responsibilities that come with a natural disaster or a declaration of disaster. Business Operations Center is one, information sharing, coordinating, working on economic recovery. But the big thing that really changed, it wasn't necessarily a change, but a difference in how we responded, was our role in donations management for the state. Previously, and for most disasters in California, donations management is locally led and locally controlled, and we are there to support their actions because California is a very large geographic state. And when something happens in Los Angeles, I'm 300 plus miles away, and I would prefer that the people in Los Angeles control and coordinate their donations. And I am more than willing to support their efforts and help them on behalf of the state. Because COVID-19 covered the entire state, we have 58 counties in California. And instead of having one central point for donations management in each county, what we did was we set it up on the state level to accept COVID-19 related donations. And we, to date, I believe it's $64 million worth of actual medical supplies that the state of California has accepted on behalf of Californians for COVID-19. We have gotten into the business of accepting these donations, dealing with warehousing, and then distributing the donations with our networks throughout California. And it's something that we had hesitated to do in the past, as I mentioned before, with the locally driven donations management. But now that we have done that, the tools that were put in place for COVID are now going to be available to help us for large disasters in the future. One of the impacts that this had on our wildfire donations is that the law is not specific saying when we're activated what donations that, like the donations that we receive do not have to be directed to the specific disaster. They have to be directed towards the people of California. And so what we are able to do, where we were able to accept donations for wildfire survivors and for locals for the wildfires during COVID-19, even before we had an actual disaster declaration for the fires because of this. And so it was an ongoing thing. It's a system that we, like I said, still in place. A team member of mine today coordinated a sub-zero freezer donation, and we're moving those things around and coordinating that up and down throughout all 58 of our counties. And it was a big change. And so because of that, we were able to jump in to working with our private sector much more in advance than we have in the past.
As Abby mentioned, California has a history of wildfires. And over the last several years, we've had to deal with public safety power shutoffs as well, a tactic used by some utility companies to reduce the risk of their equipment igniting a wildfire during critical fire conditions. This is actually a practice that is now being adopted by utilities outside of California as well. Occasionally, the two events overlapped, and now onto this already complex mix, we added the pandemic. I remember back in late 2019, I asked, okay, in 2017, we had a wildfire that burnt down part of a city up in Santa Rosa. Then in 2018, we had a wildfire that took out nearly an entire town, the Camp Fire in the town of Paradise. In 2019, we upped and changed the ante by having the Kincaid Fire on the urban wildland interface near Santa Rosa with the midst of a public safety power shutoff that took down part of the cellular communication infrastructure. So how would 2020 top that, I wondered. Apparently the answer was a pandemic. To help members think through planning and preparing for a wildfire during public safety power shutoffs or wildfires and public safety power shutoffs during a COVID pandemic, I coordinated a series of calls between May and September. These calls were not about formal presentations, but about creating a forum in which members could come together to dialogue through questions and challenges. The membership of the California Resiliency Alliance is fairly open, spanning people with operational resilience in the private sector, nonprofits, public sector agencies. And so to create a safe space for sharing, an aspect of anonymity was used for the calls. These were dial-in only calls, so I, as the host, was the only one able to see how many people were actually on. And members were free to self-identify to whatever extent they felt comfortable. It could be just their first name to full name and company or organization, depending on their level of comfort. There were no introductions. There was no going down the list of everybody who was on the call. The calls did open with a reminder that the information shared on the calls was for internal planning use only. They could share it with their team without attribution, but it was not to be shared further than that. Often as a facilitator, we really want to get everybody engaged. And yet, one of the things I learned is we process information differently. There were a lot of people on the call who stayed silent, who processed information slower. They absorbed it, then left the call, thought through what they heard, and then engaged with their team. Their processing pattern for information didn't allow them to actively engage on the call. It moved too fast for them. And so understanding that silence can be okay, that it can still be of value for the members on the call. And I got that through a feedback loop that came later as I engaged with members and talked with them, and they mentioned what they have been getting out of the calls that I was hosting. Sometimes we think getting a bunch of people together is better because you have more people to have that dialogue and idea generation and just things happening. And yes, it is true. On the larger calls, you're more likely to have more natural talkers. And yet I found that the best dialogues tended to happen in the smaller calls where there were fewer people and it was more of an intimate conversation and engagement and sharing back and forth. Though I will fully admit, there were calls that fell flat and fully failed, where I developed the prompting questions, I tried to get them engaged, and it was silent. Nobody on the call was willing to say a single word, not even in response to direct questions from me. And so we ended those. We didn't drag them on for, okay, let's sit here in silence for an hour. We just, okay, if nobody's ready to talk and engage, then we'll end the call and we'll have another call 2 weeks later. And maybe people are ready at that point. One of the things that I also learned is people are not always able to know what questions to ask. They engage differently. We were dealing with a complex environment of a pandemic that we're still trying to wrap our heads around at that time, and overlapping that with wildfires and the public safety power shutoffs. For some people, they didn't even know where to begin with asking questions. The environment was that complex for them. And so I tried to develop some prompting questions to help get dialogue flowing. But even there, it can only go so far. And sometimes the conversations were ahead of where people were in their ability and planning. And recognizing that is one of the takeaways I had and will be incorporating into things going forward this year, is I need to develop a lead up process, even for a novel event like this, to prepare people to think about different aspects of the complexity, to get them ready for that dialogue, to delve deeper. And how do I build that capacity for them through the information sharing that the California Resiliency Alliance does? At times, I wondered whether it might be easier to simply shift the calls from these dialogue forums to more informational webinars. But there was already an abundance of those out there with all sorts of vendors bringing on subject matter experts for all sorts of topics. In the end, I did host a couple of webinars, but they were very select. Sonoma County was willing to talk about their process and how they were approaching the planning for dealing with the concurrent hazards of wildfires, PSPS, in the midst of the pandemic. And that provided insights in how counties might be going about planning. All of them were at different levels of readiness in terms of preparing. Also, I hosted a National Weather Service summer weather outlook. And while the focus was on the weather, we also incorporated dialogue on How is COVID impacting the meteorologists and their ability to respond and kind of do the weather forecasting? In the end, there were two things that held me back from doing more of those types of events. One was the differing timelines. As I mentioned, a lot of counties were not yet ready to share how they're adapting their response processes because they were in the midst of trying to figure that out themselves. And so, private sector, public sector, NGOs, everybody was kind of working through this at the same point. And not everybody's comfortable sharing that uncertainty of, we're not quite sure how we're going about this. Here's the way we're approaching trying to come up with an answer. And recognizing that that creates some challenges in information sharing. The second reason was that the primary purpose of the calls was problem solving. All too often, we try and pretty up the road and make it flashy, bring in an expert to listen to because it feels more familiar and comfortable. Yet, based on the feedback that I received from members and the fact that members have asked for more of the one-off calls to bring these small groups together to talk on a focused question, there is value in creating that space for that dialogue to happen. People have their own networks and contacts that they use for benchmarking, but these calls provided a forum where they could dialogue with people from other sectors, with people outside of their networks. In addition to the planning and preparing for wildfires and PSPS during COVID calls, I also facilitated a whole series of COVID specific calls. And one of the lessons that I took away from that is that the calls that I facilitated that were topic specific and more narrow in focus tended to go better than the broader open-ended ones. It allowed people to kind of dial in, even if the conversation among the participants then meandered across several topics based on where their need and desire was. I will hold more calls like this in the future, but one of the things I will be doing is trying to focus them more and keep that narrow and allow the members then to branch out if that is of interest. The calls also gave me insight into the planning horizons of companies. I learned that some people don't look too far down that road. Their horizon is about 2 to 4 weeks out. Others have much further horizons. And for those that have those shorter horizons, they're often not yet ready to engage in conversations about those events further down, that mountain that is 2 months out, because they're still trying to figure out what they're going to be doing to that event that's 2 weeks out. And so, one of the things that I'm bringing forward, as I mentioned, is really looking and assessing how I and the California Resiliency Alliance looks at the pre-planned information flows and how do I build in elements to help people kind of expand that horizon and be ready for events that are coming further out. In addition to the calls, I also adapted other forms of communication in light of the pandemic. I adapted a lot of the wildfire communication. The two primary challenges that I made were the creation of incident resource pages. I realized early on that I was not going to be able to sustain what had been done in the past, where for the larger, more catastrophic wildfires, individual special situation reports focused just on that event were created, bringing together resources from all sorts of entities. That bandwidth just wasn't there because of the COVID response planning and support as well. So I launched an idea that I had been playing with for a while, the creation of the incident resource pages on the website that brought these together and allowed people to access that information in a little bit more real time. And these are pages that are still going to evolve. If you look back through time, they evolved from the first one to the last one I did last year, and they will evolve some more. The second change I made was the addition of COVID information to the weekly wildfire briefs. Those briefs provided a snapshot of the large wildfires that were currently active in the state. To those briefs, I added the case rates, the R effective numbers, and then once it was released, the county tiers as well, to give people an idea of, as they're looking through the wildfires, what's the COVID activity in that county. One change that I would have made through the wildfire briefs is expand it. I included only the counties that had either an active wildfire or where there was evacuations going on. But we know from past events that people often evacuate outside of their county. Looking back, I would now include the surrounding counties and the COVID information there. There is the interrelationship between the movement of people driven by wildfires and possible impacts on pandemic spread. Will they move, are they moving out of a high zone, hotspot zone into maybe a lower zone county and risk bringing the pandemic with them, or are they going the other way? So as we look at and think about the sustainability of information sharing, we need to start down that path early and really look at, okay, is this something that can be sustained as more concurrent events happen? Or do we find an alternate communication style that is more sustainable, such as the creation of the incident resource pages? Incorporating the information on concurrent threats. How do these overlap? Even though I was doing simultaneous with the weekly wildfire briefs, I was doing weekly COVID briefs, actually I think 2+ times a week. There was value in adding that information so people understood it and had it right there in the wildfire brief. And then the foundational question that kind of underlines all of the information sharing that I'm looking at and was really driven home during the pandemic last year was the foundational question of what is important for decision making. Going back to a comment I made earlier about information sharing is not just about sharing information, but also helping people understand it. A lot of the value of information is contextual. And it's not just about sharing that the current 7-day average of test positivity rate in a county is 9%, but how does that compare to the 14-day rate? What is the direction of the trend that's going on? The coronavirus is a new situation, especially last year for most people. It taught me a lot about paying more attention to the contextual elements of information sharing. Abby?
Yes. So, as Monica mentioned, we did have fires. We did have PSPS, all of these things during COVID-19, leading up to the worst that we've had. I'm not going to say the worst ever because, as Monica mentioned, you say that and then next year it's going to be awful. So if you could go to the next slide, please. August 16th through the 18th is when we had this massive lightning surge throughout the entire state of California, and many of our neighboring states also dealt with some of the ramifications. That picture there that is used, that is an actual picture from the lightning storm that was taken in Santa Barbara by one of the fire chiefs down there. And it is, I kind of had to cut it off, and if you saw the entire picture, the entire sky looks like that. That was going on for 72 hours in California. And during that 72 hours, we had over 12,000 individual lightning strikes counted. And they got to more than 650 significant fires. Now, what I mean by significant fires, those are fires that the state of California with CAL FIRE actually responded to. Now, this does not include county fires. This does not include local city fires, house fires, other things that happen within different jurisdictions. But the state of California has the wildland fires, and that was over 650 significant wildland fires. That number does include our federal partners as well. During that time, we also had a massive heat wave and a power outage throughout California that caused significant brownouts or blackouts for millions of people. During that the 72-hour siege and the 650 significant fires attributed to that, 2.1 million acres of land burned. Trying to keep that into perspective, take a look. It is larger than the state of Delaware or the state of Rhode Island. It is a massive amount of land. For the entire year of 2020, we burned over 4 million acres, which is about 4% of California's land. And that's larger than the state of Connecticut. I mean, it's just an unfathomable amount. Thankfully, most of those fires occurred on uninhabited lands that were either federal forests or state-owned land and we had minimal, and I say minimal, in compared to the campfire structures lost. But and also not to mention the dangerous air quality. If you were in California during August, parts of September, there was no escaping it. The air quality was so thick everywhere in the state that you could not do normal things outside. And thank goodness we were using N95 masks and we were stocked up on those things because they were required for just about anything. And I'm sure that many of you, if not all of you, have seen the viral pictures of San Francisco during the day where it was just orange and it looked awful. That's because one of the largest fires that we have ever seen happened right outside of San Francisco, and it was affecting the air quality there for weeks on end. Now, during all of that, we had COVID. And what did COVID restrictions have to do with all of that? So when you think of a normal fire, you think of, okay, you have to evacuate people. You have to shelter them. Well, you can't shelter them like normal sheltering in a COVID environment. So what do? We have non-congregate sheltering. I was very thankful. I don't know if this is the right term to use, thankful, but my colleagues on the other side of the country had been dealing with hurricanes and were very helpful to me in dealing with many of our private sector hotel partners and the liability issues that come along with non-congregate sheltering. And we were able to work through that. We had to have clean and safe evacuation points because even though we weren't actually sheltering people in large gymnasiums, we did have to have a place for them to go so they could get information and figure out where they could go to safely shelter. And those had to have extra precautions because of COVID. You don't know who is coming in, who is going out. And with the dangerous rate of transmission of COVID, especially in California, we had to have extra precautions in place. We have a very large, significant access and functional needs community in California that all of those things times 10 we needed to do to protect them and their health because they could not shelter at home. They could not isolate. They had to be out amongst others, and we needed to take it upon ourselves to protect them every which way we possibly could. And then finally, something that we don't normally have to concern ourselves with is the health of our firefighter crews and our law enforcement crews that are out there, the first responders that are in the field. We do take very good care of them with base camps and food and shelter and everything we could possibly do, but we had to keep them healthy. The fear was that COVID would strike one of our base camps and we would be lost without 100 or so firefighters. And we needed everybody that we possibly could have at this time, including other states coming in, as well as several international partners came in to help us fight these fires. But we had to do all this by them. Now, having said that, that's what the state had to deal with. All of my colleagues up and down the levels of government had exactly the same thing to deal with, except for on their level. And we were all trying to coordinate, not to mention every other Californian was dealing with the same thing, including our private sector. This is where the partnership between Monica and myself became very, very valuable because, as you can imagine, with all of these things happening, I was very busy. And my staff was overwhelmed with dealing with the donations management, dealing with coordinating with our local law enforcement, our local fire, helping get information for the businesses. And so having a partnership with the California Resiliency Alliance, I knew and I could trust that all of our partners would get the information they needed from Monica. And if she saw a need for a specific amount of information that I had at the government level, she took it upon herself to reach out to me and say, hey, I need this. And I had no problems trusting her to get that information out and to help our private sector individuals respond to these multiple disasters at the same time as COVID-19. So for this, we move into fall and winter. What more can we possibly have, right? Well, if you see that picture right there, that'll tell you exactly what was going on. We were all very tired. And I know I'm not alone in saying this, but I'm still tired. I'm still dealing with COVID because all of those things we mentioned did not even bring into the fact that there was a lot of civil unrest during this time and a very contentious election process. That Cal OES is also Homeland Security. And so trying to deal with all those things as a government official was difficult, but you have to take into account that everyone in California, and I would imagine the rest of the country, I can only speak for California, is feeling the exact same way. You have teams that were activated for months and months on end. The State Operations Center has been activated for, I believe the number is 322 days straight. When we get to March the 4th, we will have been activated for an entire year. So can't do the math in my head. But anyway, that's just us. Everyone else is activated as well. Monica has been working day in and day out, constantly. All of our private sector connections, the emergency managers, they are dealing with constant threats, and that weighs on you mentally and physically and emotionally. We have all of those concurrent threats. And then what we normally do to relax or to recharge were disrupted because of COVID. Personally, I like to go to the movies. I like to go to a dark movie theater and get escape into another reality, that entertainment, some kind of movie. Can't do that right now. I want to go out to dinner with friends. I want to go on a little trip or on vacation. I can't do any of those things. So what do you do for your own personal mental health? And then 24/7, it's constant news of disasters. And so this was weighing on all of us. And if it's weighing on me, I can guarantee it's weighing on the next person. It's everyone has their own struggles, everyone has their own problems. And just because I have this problem doesn't lessen or doesn't minimize my neighbor's problems. They have different problems, but they're all there and we're all dealing with the same things. So how do you move past that? How do you encourage others to take care of themselves, because you will call on them again? At all of, I fully recognize that everyone has dealt with these disasters and has this disaster fatigue. However, January came rolling around. We don't take a break. You don't take a break. January, we had the issues in the in the U.S. Capitol and dealing with our state capitals. We have right now, as Monica mentioned, coming into it, we're in the middle of a winter storm system. I'm very thankful that my power has not gone out while we've been on this call because of all of this. And I'm making phone calls and I'm reaching out to my private sector connections as we speak about the current disasters. And I have to take full into account that every single one of them is sick to death of me and tired of all of this disaster stuff.
As Abby mentioned, 2020 never really slowed down. It just kept going. It started early in January, and for some people who had international operations even before that, and it continued on. We had the hurricane season as well, that I know for many of the California Resiliency Alliance members whose areas of geography span all of the US, we're dealing with those on top of the wildfires, the pandemic, the PSPS. Continue on. Normally, once we get the winter rains, wildfires start slowing down. Then as we get into later winter, PSPS events, are no longer happening as much. We're in a La Nina. Last year, we were having wildfires pretty close to the end of the year. I remember sending out PSPS briefs around Thanksgiving. I think I sent one on Thanksgiving. PSPS happening the week before Christmas, right through Christmas. That there was no slowing down, and there hasn't been slowing down. And one of the things that meant, and where I'm sitting with kind of reevaluating also for this year, because things are not slowing down, how does that change the role of the California Resiliency Alliance? As people are getting tired, as that exhaustion is continuing, as they're not able to take perhaps the breaks that under a normal year might have been available to them. There's members who haven't really taken a vacation. There's members where their entire emergency management teams are 1 or 2 people. How do I support those people? And as this fatigue continues, the need for me to share more effectively, to be even more on the ball, to catch events more proactively becomes that much more important, because they're getting tired and they're being drawn in multiple different directions, that collective horizon scanning is at risk of no longer being quite as effective because of the fatigue. And that now puts an extra weight on those of us who are doing information sharing to up that ante, to take a more proactive role. So we've taken you through a snapshot journey and shared some of the insights and lessons that we gained from 2020. To tie up this presentation, Abby and I want to leave you with 4 key takeaways. I want to start with 2020, the year of the asterisk. In many cases, the year 2020 is going to need this asterisk, and in some cases, years into the future are going to need to carry that asterisk of impacted by a global COVID pandemic. Think about the year-over-year Q2 sales of toilet paper. Kind of unfair to compare 2020 to 2019. And how's 2021 going to look? Or refinery production outputs when we had the stay-at-home orders. Revenue sales of restaurants. 2020 likely made statistically significant drops in the average life expectancy of people, which will take years before that trend line is back where it was. It'll have impacts across health statistics all over the place. The significant amount of deaths caused by the pandemic will mean that future deaths from other causes may go down because those people are no longer alive. But does that mean we're actually healthier? There were changes in how and where we worked, changes that for some may become more permanent, changes that affect how we need to do risk assessments and include the communities where our employees live, not just where our facilities are located. COVID mitigation measures drove up the costs of disaster response and compounded the economic recovery burdens of communities hit by dual disasters. In our technology-driven world, we have set up dashboards and algorithms to tell us all sorts of information, but are they equipped to handle the asterisk of 2020? What about our processes? Are they equipped to handle that asterisk? My second key takeaway is stepping back to reassess more frequently. For many of us, we have been on a fairly nonstop revolving course of disaster response since early 2020, if not even earlier, as mentioned before. Something I've tried to do over the years, and which last year really drove home, is the practice of taking the time to step back and reassess. It's easy to get caught up in that momentum and forget to stop and reorientate ourselves. Throughout 2020, I would take time to reassess information needs and how the situation was evolving, to look ahead for potential obstacles and potential future cascading impacts of current actions. Yet, even with that, one of the changes I would make to my 2020 response is to step back and reassess more often and to capture that assessment in writing. I'm not talking anything formal, basic bullet points, but just so that when I reassess the next time, I have something to look back. Oh, yeah, that was something I picked up over here. How have I adapted and evolved because of that? There is something about that process of writing it down, of capturing it. So when we have so many things happening concurrently, it's easy to get disorientated and to focus on what is loudest, not that which is most needed, to lose sight of the unintended consequences, where today's solutions become tomorrow's problems. Those are my two key takeaways. Abby, I hand it over to you for the final two in closing.
Of course, thank you. Adaptability is so important. Communication. That is, we need to evolve. We need to constantly be changing and constantly be looking at how we communicate with everyone. Um, Most people, if not all people, are more than capable of handling these kinds of situations. They just need all of the information. They need to have a full view of what's going on, the situational awareness. How we get that to these people is the question. And that's how during COVID, we had to constantly change, constantly reassess, look at our situation. Are we reaching the right people? Are we doing this? And how are we doing it? And what can we do better? Also, with communication, redundancy is the name of the game. You cannot over communicate with these people. You need to try every avenue you possibly can in order to get the proper information to them. And then finally, the most important thing for myself, as I mentioned earlier in one of the other slides, is having those established, trusted partners to be able to lean on and to connect with as you move forward. As mentioned, there's only the state of California when it comes to the private sector liaison. I have counterparts on the different county levels and the city levels throughout this state. I have counterparts that are in other states, some of which you'll hear from later today. And we often communicate, talk to each other, but I have to trust them and I have to have these relationships in advance. I don't know who said it, some brilliant person has said it in the past, but a disaster is no place to be exchanging business cards. You should know who these people are before that happens. And then finally, with those trusted established partnerships, you need to have folks like Monica in your area, in your state, in your industry, in order to collaborate with, be concerned with, you know, with Monica, I knew that they were going to handle several of the items that I could not handle. But I also know that if I called her and I said, I can't do this anymore, she would know how to help me and assist me get to where I needed to be. One of the most perfect examples is during the beginning of March when we declared the disaster. The governor of California had decided to close the state, to shut down the state. As someone that comes from the business world and as someone that has an economics background, that terrified me. I knew what that meant. I knew how difficult it was going to be, and I knew what was going to happen because of it. I found out about an hour before it actually happened, and I called Monica and I said, "It's coming." And she said, "What, LA?" And I said, "No, no, no, much, much bigger." And I said, "We got to get ready for this. We got to do this because all of our businesses are going to need to know this kind of stuff. What does this mean? How does this work? What are essential services? What are all of these questions that are coming?" We had to reassess. We had to evolve how we deal with things. And because we had the established partnerships and I trusted her, I was able to walk through how are we going to communicate with the locals and with the business community in California as we move through this new uncharted territory. So with that, I know it was kind of a depressing talk, but we did have lessons learned. And I think the most important lesson for both Monica and myself is we're still here. We made it through and we're still going and we're still doing our thing. And this didn't get us. We're stronger than ever.
Thank you, Monica and Abby. It was very thorough. We really appreciate that. Can tell you gave this presentation a lot of thought and it showed. We have just a minute for a quick question, if I may. Regarding the COVID vaccine prioritization, is CDPH or Cal OES providing guidance to local public health on defining which critical infrastructure workers should be Tier 1B essential workers? DHS's definition is quite broad. For example, bank branch tellers.
Yes, I can answer that. So the California Department of Public Health, CDPH, has created a very detailed guidance as to what qualifies for the different tiers in California. All of that can be found at covid19.ca.gov. Happy to provide that to anyone and get them where they need to be. We have several different work groups that have been put together, including top business leaders in California, to help define and inform those decision-making process. The guidance is then passed to our counties and our county local public health to make the decision on behalf of all of their counties. Because as you know, the counties are the ones distributing the vaccine, and the counties are the ones that are responsible. And so therefore, we are providing guidance and they are doing what is best for their local communities.
Thanks, Abby. And we did get another comment through the chat that says, "Thank you for your presentation. It was very honest." And I think that's a really good way to put it. So thank you, Abby and Monica, for being here today. Stay safe.
Thank you.
And feel free to reach out to either of us if you have more questions.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, guys.